Hi, and welcome to Host Chat for our 3 week study on First Corinthians chapter 15. Thanks for continuing to lead our saints through this and this opportunity to kind of look at this chapter on the resurrection. A couple things we need to think about before we begin. One is that we're taking this chapter just right out of context. It is in a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth. Technically, even though this letter is entitled First Corinthians, there is a previous letter that we do not have. So this is Paul's second correspondence. And what that means is a couple things. Paul has an existing relationship with them. Paul actually is one of the people who planted the gospel there in Corinth. So he's got an existing relationship with them. And that means that this letter is prompted by two things. One is that there are some things that he's heard or seen that he's responding to. And secondly, that in their response to the previous letter, they actually asked some questions. And so if we were to read the entire book, we would hear Paul sometimes addressing problems that he's heard, sometimes problems that came up in the letter that they wrote back, but definitely some specific questions as to questions that they raise. They would say, so what about this? And Paul would say, now considering that, let me give you some insight. Now, chapter 14 or 15 for us really, we're going to take it as a just its own self-standing section because it is really on the import and the meaning and the impact of the resurrection. And so there's some debate about the shift from chapter 14 to 15. That's probably broader than your study is going to need to discuss. But part of what Paul's doing is that Paul is responding to uh, a subtext here that there might be many gospels or different flavors of gospels. Sometimes we like to think of faith as a salad bar that we get to go through and pick the parts that we want. And the beginning of this, really, Paul saying, no, there's a gospel, and the parts are significant. And so that's kind of where we find we have people maybe as we read through this entire section together, you're going to hear him address some questions and some hypotheticals that really are where people are. Some people were uncomfortable with the resurrection. Some people today think it was much more symbolic. Um, people think, well, we can have all sorts of different opinions and understandings of the resurrection, and yet Paul's going to say this is what is most important. So let's sort of walk through our text. Verses 1 and 2, Paul asserts that there is a gospel, not a gospel, but the gospel. Now, brothers and sisters, I would remind you, I want to refresh your memory uh, of the gospel. Now, in your study guide, you'll see lots of references to where Paul has either preached the gospel or talked about the gospel. So it's not the first time that this has sort of come up. And then the second half of verse 1, we really get that faith transmission. I preached it to you, and you received it, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved if you hold it fast. Now, that first second half of verse 1 and the first half of verse 2 really correlate well with questions 3 and 4 in the study guide about the way that faith is transferred and maybe our participation in that, our understanding of that. And then in the second half of verse 2, it says, now the word I preached to you, again, reminding, notice how that mirrors I preached in verse 1, the word I preached to you in verse 2, unless you believed it in vain. And in vain really there means, it's really not the best translation. It really means sort of like hastily. You didn't consider what the gospel really was. Much more along the lines of in the parable of the sower, the seed that sprouts up really quick but grows no roots, right? Yeah, that sounds good enough to me. That's fantastic. But when the sun comes out, when we're really tested, when we get under some pressure, we may be believed in vain because we didn't fully consider, we hastily made a decision, we didn't think about what a commitment to Christ really looked like. And that's what he's really saying there. And then verse 3 he sort of turns. Now, verses 3 through 7 are likely a early church creed, if you will, a creedal statement about what we believe. Um, some will argue that it's really maybe 3 to 5, but definitely 3 to 5, if not 3 to 7, uh, had a creedal existence before Paul, which is on par with what he says that he received the gospel also that he passes on to you. And that's what he says in verse 3. For I delivered to you of first importance. The primary reason that Paul came was to give the gospel. And he gave it, and notice what he says, but I also received it. Question 6 is interesting for your group to discuss about the importance of Paul, of the gospel not starting with Paul. This isn't Paul's gospel. This was the gospel of Jesus Christ that began before him, that he received, and now he's also passing that on. He's living into that pattern that he talked about in verse 1 and verse 2. So he delivered it as first importance, and then we notice there's sort of 4 basic affirmations. Now, this isn't a comprehensive affirmation of faith, but it's interesting that the early church really highlighted 4 things that were crucial for Christians to know. And so I think it's a great aspect for your group to discuss. Question 8's about that. Um, First, that Christ died for our sins, that there was an intentional, sacrificial, atoning death for our sins specifically. He didn't die as an example. He didn't die to let us know that someone cares. He died specifically to address our sins in accordance with the scriptures. Second, that he was buried. Now, the buried part seems pretty, uh, not that significant. But what it really says is that he's really dead. He's really dead. He was so dead that they buried him, and that he wasn't just sort of sleeping, he wasn't sort of faking, he was dead. Third, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. That it's a crucial aspect, and that's going to be what's crucial about this and the rest of chapter 15 is the import and impact of resurrection. It's not a figurative resurrection, it's not a metaphorical resurrection, but an actual resurrection, that he was raised from the dead. Notice the language. He was raised. God raised him. Jesus didn't raise himself. Um, and that, and again, according to the scriptures. And then in verse 5, that he appeared to Cephas, better we know him as Peter, and then to the 12. And then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of us who are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. And then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. That's where that creedal statement sort of ends. And it's interesting that of those parts, the longest one is on the resurrection sightings, that people saw the risen Lord. Um, Now, notice he appeared to Peter. Why is that significant? It's a good question when people get mentioned is why are they mentioned? Peter's mentioned because not only is he a leader in the early church, but he's the one who doubted, who denied Jesus 3 times. And so the fact that Peter, who was once a denier, now stands by this testimony that he is raised, that says that it happened, right? One moment he's like, I don't even know the guy. And now he's so convinced that he's the risen Lord that eventually he's going to go and die on his own cross for Jesus. Uh, but he didn't just appear to Peter, he also appeared to the rest of the disciples. Um, and then he continued to appear to 500 brothers at one time, lots of people. And Paul writes, and some of these are eyewitnesses who are still alive. So Paul's saying, I've talked to these people who this can still be substantiated. And then he appeared to James. Now, James is not the son of Zebedee here. This is James, the brother of Jesus. And part of the reason that he's mentioned is that he didn't really buy the whole Jesus thing. He didn't think Jesus was the Messiah for a time. And so the fact that he comes around and has had an experience with the risen Lord that has changed his mind from doubter or someone that's realigning the story in a different direction to believer, um, that really says that this happened. And then to all the apostles. Then in verse 8, it shifts from that creedal statement to Paul. Um, Last of all, of one born untimely, he appeared to Paul. And he talks about him being the least of the apostles, unworthy of even being called apostle, because he persecuted the church. Again, one of the biggest arguments we have, one of the greatest proofs we have of the resurrection, is the transformed lives of disciples. Peter was a denier who becomes a proclaimer. James was a doubter and didn't see it, and now his experience with the risen Lord transforms him into someone who proclaims and is a leader in the early church. Paul gives you even more insight into his story. He was one who persecuted the church because he didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. And then, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. He appeared to him, and so he now is a proclaimer. Um, so he talks about how that was by the grace of God, not with him. Uh, Question 14 is good on this section. As you get to the end in verse 11, whether it was I or they, so we preached and you believed. That's back to that transmission. It also reminds us of a theme earlier. Paul wasn't the only person there. He talks much earlier in the book about whether maybe Paul planted and Apollos watered, but God brings the growth and God gets the glory. And so he's kind of wrapping up there to say it doesn't matter if it was from me you heard it or from Apollos you heard it. The gospel leads to life, and it's the gospel that was received, that was preached in, was received, which they stand, by which they're being saved, and if they hold it fast. And that question 19 really is a question about where do we find ourselves in those settings now. Thanks so much for your leadership. Fantastic passage here, just dripping with goodness and insight. May God bless your group as you meet. Take care and God bless.